The stench in the chamber hung thick and stale, heavy with the scent of sickness and the putrid sweetness of dying flesh. William, once the mighty conqueror, was now just a collection of agonizing pains, his bowels in revolt, his mind slipping between lucidity and the fog of fever. Even after the mercy of a drawn-out death, the humiliation for William wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. What followed would stain his legacy in ways no battlefield ever had. There were no crowds mourning in silence, no graceful farewell, only panic, disgust, and a final act so foul it left priests gagging and nobles speechless. William's fury broke upon Mantes like a storm. Churches crumbled, homes exploded into flame, fields turned to ash. The cries of the dying mingled with the roar of fire. The fires, though, had begun before Mantes. Days earlier, his army had swept through the Vexin, a volatile strip between Normandy and the French crown, torching villages, laying waste to crops, and turning the countryside into smoldering ruin. But why such fury? Why raze a town to the ground in such a savage way? To understand, we must go back to a moment not of war, but of ridicule. It had begun, as so many great downfalls do, with an act of petty rage. Months before, in the scorching heat of July 1087, William, now a man of nearly 60, heavy-bellied and still burdened by the iron will that had crossed the Channel and claimed a kingdom, had ridden out from his Norman capital. His target, Mantes, a rebellious French town on the border of his restless dominion. Weeks earlier, in the courts of France, King Philip I had mocked William openly. Word had reached Normandy of the insult. "The King of England is so swollen with fat," Philip had sneered. "He looks ready to give birth. When he's delivered, we shall light candles in celebration." It was more than a joke. It was a calculated humiliation, a public mockery of a man whose legend was built on strength, dominance, and fear. The insult, delivered with the sting of truth, festered in William's proud heart. He had always been a man of immense appetites, for power, for conquest, for food. Now, his age and increasing girth were becoming a target for ridicule, a symbol of his perceived decline. So William, ignoring the warnings of his physicians, had mounted his war horse. His intent was clear: to devastate Mantes. As William rode through the burning streets, surveying the inferno he had unleashed, fate, with its usual grim irony, intervened. His horse, startled by a sudden flicker of flame or perhaps by the agonizing heat, lurched violently. His aging body, less agile than in his youth, was thrown forward, his abdomen slamming against the high pommel of his saddle. A searing pain ripped through him, a sharp, white-hot agony that stole his breath. He clutched his gut, his face contorted. The blow, brutal and unforeseen, had ruptured his intestines, a wound that, in an age without antiseptic or surgery, was a death sentence waiting to unfold. He was carried north to Rouen, to the priory of Saint-Gervais, as the heat of summer bore down upon Normandy. There, confined to a narrow bed within the quiet of the monastery, the king's condition worsened. The blow had triggered something deeper, an infection perhaps, or a rot that medicine could not mend. His once regal presence was now diminished, surrounded by the grim reality of a body succumbing to its own poisoned interior. For 5 long weeks he lingered, trapped between life and death, his suffering a public spectacle for his court. The weight of his past, the blood he had shed, the lands he had seized, now pressed down on him. Chroniclers of the time spoke of his torment, both physical and spiritual. Orderic Vitalis, a monk and historian, recorded William's own agonizing confession during these final weeks. "I justly carry with me to the grave the burden of my awful deeds. Now that the terrible illness has overtaken me, I was brought up in treachery and inured to bloodshed from the moment I seized the reins of government." He recounted the devastation of England, the slaughter, the famine, the suffering he had brought upon the land he had conquered. His words became a litany of remorse, a confession wrung from a man standing at the edge of judgment. At his bedside stood his sons, William Rufus and Henry Beauclerc. Their presence offered no comfort, only bitter tension. They were heirs already measuring their futures in the growing shadow of their father's death. His estranged eldest son, Robert Curthose, was notably absent. Still in France, under the protection of the French king, exiled by the consequences of a rebellion years earlier. The Conqueror had always struggled with his eldest, Robert, a rebellious and impulsive son who had repeatedly challenged his authority. William, ever the pragmatist, now had to face the fragmentation of his empire. He named Robert as Duke of Normandy, a reluctant inheritance. England, the prize of his life's work, he left to William Rufus, his second son, whom he believed possessed the strength and ruthlessness to hold it. Henry, the youngest, received only a sum of silver. But William, with a flash of his old cunning, prophesied, "You, my son, will one day possess all that I leave behind and be greater than either of your brothers." It was a prophecy that would come to fruition. As his strength ebbed, the agony intensified. The internal putrefaction spread, and the stench became unbearable to those around him. His skin, once bronzed by sun and wind, turned a sickly pallor, his features drawn and gaunt. His voice, once a thunderous command, was now a reedy whisper. Yet, even in this diminished state, the old iron will flickered. He held on, fighting for every breath, for every moment, perhaps still believing he could defy even death itself. But even the mightiest will cannot conquer the inevitable. On September 9th, 1087, as the first light of dawn touched the spires of Rouen, William the Conqueror finally released his hold on life. What followed was a macabre farce, a grim testament to the transient nature of power. No sooner had the final breath rattled from William's broken lungs than the illusion of loyalty evaporated like mist at sunrise. The chamber, once solemn and heavy with the weight of royal suffering, erupted into chaos. His attendants, noblemen, priests, squires, the very men who had eaten at his table, sworn oaths by his side and praised him as king, now revealed their true allegiance, not to the man, but to his crown. And with the crown now vacant, so too was their loyalty. They stripped the room bare with greedy haste. His sword, once a symbol of conquest, was snatched up like mere plunder. Silks were torn from his bed, rings wrenched from cooling fingers, robes ripped from his stiffening limbs. The dignity of kingship dissolved in the scramble for loot. There was no mourning, no reverence, only the frantic rustle of stolen cloth and the hurried clatter of boots fleeing into the uncertain dawn. Fear gripped them. The power vacuum left by a dead monarch was a dangerous thing, and none wished to be caught in the storm that might follow. They scattered like rats from a sinking ship, leaving their king naked and alone upon the cold flagstones. And so William lay, not on a funeral bier adorned with gold and incense, but sprawled awkwardly on stone, limbs twisted, mouth agape. A king abandoned, a conqueror left to rot. The stillness of the room was broken only by the buzzing of flies, drawn already by the sour scent of death. Hours passed before any dared return. It was not nobles or royal guards who stepped forward, but a few loyal servants and local clergy, not out of hope for reward, but from a fading sense of duty. They wrapped the body in linen and arranged for its transport to Caen, to the Abbey of Saint-Étienne. William had founded that abbey decades earlier, a penitential offering to God in recompense for his marriage to Matilda of Flanders, a union initially forbidden by the church. It was meant to be his final resting place, a sanctified ground on which he might plead, in death, for the mercy he had seldom shown in life. But the journey was no stately procession. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Norman roads, the heat festering inside the cart that bore the king's corpse. Days passed, and the body, already bloated with death, began to turn. The stench became unbearable. Local villagers, upon seeing the passing train and catching its scent, crossed themselves in dread and turned away. Birds circled above, dogs barked and refused to approach. At last, they reached Caen. Monks gathered at the gates, their faces drawn with a mixture of dread and obligation. A thin veil of incense drifted through the abbey, a futile attempt to sanctify what rot had already claimed. A modest crowd had assembled, clergy, minor nobles, townsfolk, summoned by duty or curiosity. The atmosphere was not one of reverence, but of unease. The conqueror had returned, but not in glory. From the crowd, a man stepped forward. His name was Asselin. He was not armed, nor draped in noble robes, but his voice carried with conviction. "This ground," he cried, pointing to the very spot where the tomb had been dug, "was stolen. My father owned this land. It was seized by this man, this tyrant, for the building of his abbey. I claim it still. Let not the body of a robber be laid in my earth." Gasps rippled through the assembly. William Rufus, his son and successor, stood frozen. The monks glanced to one another in dread. The challenge was legitimate. The abbey had indeed been built on confiscated land, like so much of William's empire, taken without apology. A hurried negotiation followed. Asselin demanded restitution. William Rufus, pressed and humiliated, paid him 60 shillings on the spot, a significant sum. Only then, with coin changing hands like a ransom, did the burial continue. It was a final legal obstacle for a man who had once bent the laws of kingdoms to his will. But the worst was yet to come. When the monks attempted to place the body into its stone sarcophagus, they discovered a final, hideous complication. The tomb, carved years earlier to standard dimensions, had been built for a king. But not this king. Not the man whose body, already swollen in life, had now grown grotesquely swollen in death, stretched and soured by days of rot beneath the relentless summer sun. He had been transformed into something unrecognizable, bloated, rigid, and seeping. There was no dignity left to preserve. The linen wrappings strained at the seams. His limbs had stiffened into awkward angles. The monks hesitated, whispering among themselves. There was no room. Still, the burial had to proceed. So they pushed. The bearers pressed down, grunting and red-faced. Monks stood by, pale and sweating, their hands fluttering helplessly as the body refused to yield. Then, with a sound like wet parchment tearing, it happened. A split. A rupture. The abdomen burst. Putrefaction poured forth in a wave of fluid and gas. The organs, already half liquefied, collapsed out of the torn cavity. A torrent of rot cascaded down the inside of the tomb and onto the abbey floor. The stench hit like a fist, a sour, choking cloud of bile and sulfur, thick with the stink of death and long-held corruption. The candles sputtered and hissed. One was extinguished entirely. Some fell to their knees, gagging. Others turned and ran, covering their faces with their robes. A few vomited outright. The chants ceased. The air grew still, but for the echo of retreating boots and the groans of those too sickened to flee. This was no royal funeral. It was a spectacle of horror. The rites were rushed. The priests, their vestments stained and their voices quivering, recited the final prayers in brittle Latin, barely audible over the coughing and murmurs. There was no organ music, no choir, no final blessing from a great bishop. Only the cold scrape of stone as the tomb was hastily sealed, trapping the stench inside with the remains. No triumph, no glory, no final salutes from banners or knights. The mourners, few as they were, did not linger. They slipped away like shadows, leaving behind only smoke from incense too weak to mask the smell, and a silence not of reverence but of unease. And so ended William the Conqueror. Not on the field of Hastings, cloaked in victory and steel, but here, ruptured, defiled, and buried in haste. Not crowned by triumph, but crushed by his own flesh. His body was lowered into earth he had once stolen, in a church he had built for atonement. And still, in the end, even that turned against him. His empire would endure for a time, but the man was gone. The sword that once shaped nations could not shield him from death, nor could gold buy back his dignity. The flames he loosed on Mantes had traveled with him. Through pain, through fire, through rot. They had touched his deathbed, haunted his burial, and now clung to his legacy. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. It helps us immensely. To explore more stories like this one, click the video on screen now and subscribe to walk with us into the next forgotten tale.